We'll go ahead and officially call the meeting to order for the level 3, level 4 committee. And this, and first let me say, I'm Greg Patterson. I think everybody know Alicia Radford. She's my co-chair. Wow. Okay, this is very impressive to see the group and the attendance here today compared to what we saw in August, and really kind of kicking some things off and ultimately what we've done so far. Just let's give you a couple of housekeeping things. Need to approve the August 13, 2021 meeting minutes. There's a motion. There's a second. All right. Any additions or corrections to those meeting minutes? Seeing none. All those in favor? No opposition. Thank you. All right. As far as grant, let me see. Can we get back to the agenda item? I'm just letting you on the computer. Standing items, grants update. We do not have any updates that I know of at this point based on any grants. We're still continuing to work on some initial grants to fund hopefully some of the projects that we'll have. Really go right into whole business. I want to ask Dr. Ashley to come up and talk about our recent level 3 and level 4 readiness cost overview if you have a minute. You got a change?
Yep, it's right underneath the PDF.
So for those of you, I see a few familiar faces back there that were here at the last meeting. You get to hear the same thing again. If you need to get a cup of coffee or step out another time of day.
Abbreviated version, no level 1, 2 costs.
Yeah, very abbreviated, but specifically for this group. So, I've got a regroup here. Let me just think. So we're focused on 3s and 4s. Again, I don't know. I think Greg, I need to go into like sort of what it is because this is sure fresh again.
If you don't mind, this is fresh. This is fresh.
Okay, I don't want to be redundant, but I don't want to leave anybody out either. So when we talk about trauma center readiness, you know, to be a level 3 center and a level 4 center, the American College of Surgeons has the orange book now. It's going to change colors here soon because we're going to have a conversion. So it tells you you have to do these things, and if you do these things, you'll pass site visit and you'll be a trauma center. So we all live by that book. The 1s and 2s are in the book. You're in the book. And so we did a 1 and 2, which you've heard about for years, survey, and we know what the costs are for 1 and 2 of those criteria, what you have to do in that book to be a trauma center. There's a cost associated with that. And so nobody in the country can tell you what the costs are for a 3 and a 4. That's not been done to the best of our knowledge, at least not inclusively. And so we want, and you all ask us, what are the costs? And we ask you, what are your costs? And nobody seems to really know. So that's where this came about. We wanted to focus on the 3s and the 4s and give you the same scrutiny and the same love, if you will, as far as this is how you do it. Let's really do a deep dive. You know, Jessica back there, raise your hand, Jessica from Warren Hayward, you know, our financial consultant that worked with the 1s and 2s that have now worked with the 3s and 4s to validate the data so that we're all on the same page. So very nice work pulling all this together. Thank you. You guys did a great job. These are not easy to do. The survey, you know, you did the work, pull together. I mean, so kudos to you. This is the fruits of your labor, so to speak. But just to show you the cost of trauma center readiness, or the costs incurred before the first patient is ever seen or treated. These are the costs when the book says you have to have A, B, and C. This is the cost of it. It's not, this is the cost of treating the patient or sending the bill. That's not what we're talking about. And there are non-patient care costs which the hospital would not have to pay if it were not a trauma center. In other words, something you could jettison, if you will. You don't have to have these things in the orange book because you're not a trauma center. So those are what we mean when we talk about readiness costs. And when you talk about this to your legislator, These are readiness costs. These are not bills. These are things that you really can't recoup if you don't know what your costs are. So the Georgia Trauma Commission, we've been interested in this because we're responsible to pay you, to fund you through the trauma fund. And we need to be fair. Our job is to be fair and equitable for all. And so that's why us, the Trauma Commission, knowing what your costs are, and we never have enough funding to pay for all your costs, but at least have some idea, is why we're so interested in what your costs are, to make sure that we are fair in distribution of the funds. And when we're grossly low in those distributions, how do we advocate and go to the legislators and get more funds? You can't just show up and say, gosh, I think we need, $100 million. Well, why do you need it? Where's it gonna go? Like I talked about earlier, you've got to have a plan for how you're gonna spend the money. So these are, to refresh your memories, you see this was presented back in 2018. We had $10 million for annual readiness costs for level 1, $5 million for level 2. Most of the costs were in the form of clinical medical staff, on-call staff, and the lowest cost for education and outreach. That when we analyze, doesn't mean that's not important. It just means when you looked at cost, people weren't spending as much on that category as they were the clinical medical staff. And it sort of makes sense. You have to have the teams ready to go 24/7. If you got some money left over, you'll spend it on some outreach, but you can always use more. So this has been very powerful at the Capitol to say, we need dollars in these areas, and this is why. So now, with the formation of such an organized committee, and this is so great, and this is, I told Liz to take a picture, so this is incredible to have level 3s, the room is full, so we've come so far, in a short period of time, so you guys are rock stars. It's great to see everybody in the room. So here we go, level 3 and level 4 readiness costs. This just came in. I'm still digesting the data myself. And it was, as I said, this cost survey was done exactly like it was for the 1s and 2s, as far as the same scrutiny and as far as the same analysis. And again, we use the Orange Book. There are some limitations to this study, just like there was with the 1 and 2s. It is self-reporting. There's no super sophisticated audit, if you will, where every single dollar is audited. But there is a very validated financial process in place through Warren Haber that uses financial principles to standardize and make sure that we are validated. So that is a strength. Another thing that we dealt with is while we were going through this, you might consider a limitation of the study. Several hospital systems were involved in acquisitions, and that limited access to supporting documentation a little bit. It's never perfect timing, but with the healthcare situation the way it is now, people are moving and shifting and joining different teams. That made it a little bit more challenging, but we landed on our feet thanks to the good work of all of you and the Trauma Commission team. Won't go through all the methods. Basically, you've lived through the methods. You know how you were contacted, how you worked, and how you came up with things, really the way the 1s and 2s did. And then obviously down at the bottom, the most important piece is the validation process to make sure that we were doing it the right way. So here we go. Trauma Center readiness cost, a summary. There's 4 big categories that we group everything into for 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. So the administrative program support staff costs, the top left-hand corner, clinical medical staff, in-house OR availability, and education outreach. This is similar to a Florida paper back in 1999, similar how they group things. It just seems to flow this way. We sort of stayed with that same categorization. And you can see here for the 3s, I don't know if you can read that from the back of the room, so I'll just read the numbers to you. About 780,000 was the mean that the level 3 spent on administrative program support staff. That includes several different things I'll go over in a minute. The level 4s were at about 79,000. Clinical medical staff on call, about 920,000 was the average spent by level 3s, not mandated by the 4s, no cost there. In-house OR building, not mandated for either one by the Orange Book. And then education and outreach, mean 13,000 for level 3s, 2,000 for level 4, And you see at the bottom, the take-home message, you probably really want to see 1.7 million, the mean cost for a level 3 to cover everything that's in the orange book. That's the cost to you, and that's a conservative number, you know, that you can do this. Very solid about quoting that number. And then 81,000 for the level 4s. Probably a little more than that for both, but those are solid numbers that you can have confidence in. This is important as we work through this because this is what you need. So as we advocate for more dollars, we can go to the legislature and say, look, these are our costs. So now we have costs for all 4 level of trauma centers. As we try to recruit other centers to come into the system, we can at least show them to meet all the standards in that orange book by the American College of Surgeons. This is about what it's going to cost you. This is sort of how it looks. So this is sort of helpful to other centers that may be thinking about coming on as well. Now, to look specifically at those 4 categories very quickly, just breaking it down, what are the cost drivers in each category? This is the administrative category that I just showed you. And it's made up of these components you see listed here to the far left, such as the senior administrator support, trauma director, trauma program manager, and so on. And you can see there, the trauma program manager is the main cost driver in this, which is not surprising. That's really the person that's dedicated to the trauma service that really focuses on trauma. 67,000 for a level 3, 46,000 for a level 4. Remember, these are folks these are costs specifically assigned to trauma. In the level 4s, you may have, as I found out, and as you well know, you may have where one person may wear 4 hats. Okay, so people are stretched sort of thin. If you look at the program support staff, which are things like respiratory therapy, physical therapists, occupational therapists, you know, that whole list of things here, I won't go through each one. You can have all these slides. You're welcome to have it. Please can get that for you if you want to dive down to each one. But we sort of grouped it together into the 4 or 5 big drivers that you can see here. Respiratory therapy is one of the main drivers for the level 3s, as well as the level 4s. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, all over $100,000. Physical therapy right at $100,000, and case management about $87,000. So again, some real dollars that are assigned to your center for your trauma patients. Looking at clinical medical staff, this is interesting. These are the surgeons that are on call that you have to pay to be on call to be a trauma center. You can see not mandated for a 4, but for the 3s, it's an issue. Trauma surgery is the main driver in that cost. $326,000 average for the cost that trauma centers are putting out, the level 3 centers. Trauma physician, nothing there. So orthopedics, $166,000 average. And then you see neurosurgery, about $80,000, which again, I don't think neurosurgery is mandated for a 3. Some 3 centers have a neurosurgery, so they did have some costs. They reported in that, but not necessarily mandated there. So your main drivers for a level 3 center in your medical staff costs for on call appear to be the trauma surgeon and the orthopedic surgeon. Then education and outreach, and these are pretty small numbers. You know, injury prevention mean for 3, $87, community outreach, $1,100, professional education, $1,900. Not a lot of money going into that. And then these are things like CME, you know, education for your providers, such as your trauma medical director, or your trauma program manager, or your trauma registrars. You can see numbers are low, but for these centers, any dollar spent on anything can add up and affect the bottom line. So the take home message here, level 3 centers, average annual revenues costs are $1.7 million. The most significant cost is the trauma surgeon staff. And then the lowest cost is education and outreach. And then in the level 4s, the average is $81,000. The trauma director is the main cost driver. And the TMD participation costs are the lowest cost. That's it. Good? Okay.
Any questions of that? I hope everybody, at least a footprint on where we are and what it's costing us. And so I think one of the biggest things that we've heard initially from everyone is how can we be on the same footing in meetings like this with the level ones and level twos? And how can we get our voice heard? And so one of the things was we need to show them what it cost us and what we're putting into this. What is our skin in the game? If you think back to the statistics that the Dr. Ashley gave us earlier on, 7 cents on the dollar for readiness cost on average, and then 17 cents per dollar for uncompensated care. So every one of us now has proven that we have skin in the game and we're not slacking off. We're not doing that. Just a couple of thoughts on this. I think, in all honesty, the level 4 numbers to me are very low. And I think part of it is not having participated in any one of these studies before, but also maybe even some fear about reporting some of these numbers to your own administration, to us. So you can see it's probably a whole lot more than that, I would think. Even for the level 3 is probably a little bit more. Just as I thought the level 1 and 2 survey, which I participated in as a level 2 before we dropped back to level 3, based on cost issues, and that was on-call staff that were a big deal for us, being probably one of the smallest 2s in the state at the time. We need to report those things. We need to understand where this money comes from so we can actually go back and ask for more, but also the Georgia Trauma Commission can go back and ask for more. We need these numbers. So I really thank everybody for this study. Other old business, you heard about March pause this morning, something I think we're all excited about. That's why we asked Courtney Twilliger to come today. Courtney, you want to talk about that at all, or say anything about March pause? You saw the algorithm. We met for a 2-day meeting at Lake Blackshear, coming up with a course. I think the initial draft of the course is in place, and we're trying to beef that up so we can go out. This will be something that you can go out and teach every rural center out there to handle trauma, so they're not scared of it. Everybody gets, it's like a hot potato. You get a trauma that comes in, everybody wants to transfer it so quick. And we know that one of the major issues we have is transfer times and transfer equipment. We don't have the EMS units. We don't have the right transfer system. The weather may not be right for an air transport. So this teaches you to handle those situations, and ultimately we can provide education to improve the educational level of everyone out there, but also improve patient outcomes is what we want to do. And I think that's what the original grant was for Emmanuel Medical Center and Courtney's project there. And y'all want to say anything about that?
The only thing for 43 years I ran at EMS at Emmanuel Medical Center as an EMS director. Get back so much ago. This one the thought process came to me when one of my medics came to the ER pushing a patient. I was talking to Brooke Morris, she's our ER manager, and she just walked by with a patient and just walked through the ER and looked at Brooke and said, "The stroke?" She said, "Yeah." So a few minutes later, the medic didn't speak to anyone. She walked through. A few minutes later, she came back. She had blood tubes. She talked to the ER nurse who had the printouts that they started together, putting the labels on the blood tubes to take them to lab. A few minutes later, the patient came back in our ER. They had AU on telemedicine to look at that stroke patient. So they called in a stroke alert. The ER looked at the patient records, started that up, called radiology. They had the CT scanner going. Everything clicked. There was no conversation to speak of. Didn't need it. We had a plan. We didn't have that with trauma. Okay, trauma is, Dr. Patterson, it's a hot potato. You know, our medics bring a trauma in. Why'd y'all bring them here? We're not we're a level 4 center. They should have gone invested. Another story is I was a medic. Our goal was to take them directly to a level 1 center. Okay, that's an hour and a half from us. So, 18 years old, gun to his chest, pulled the trigger. He shouldn't have done that, but he did. So my medic brought him to our hospital. So I was hot. I was ill. So those of you who know me know that sometimes I can misbehave, but I did something unusual that day. I actually listened to what he had to say. He said, "Well, he's got a lung full of blood." By the time I got into his dust, the other me full of blood, he was dead. Dr. A was working that day, put a chest tube in, that kid's out doing something today, I don't know what he's doing in his life. And if they had followed my instructions, based on the CDC scheme about how to take care of critical patients, the kids would have died. So we need to find a different way. We need to train our EMS people better so that if it can go to a level 1 or 2 center, it should. But if it needs blood or needs a chest tube or some kind of advanced airway, it needs to come to our center. And then it needs to be immediately treated and transferred on. Okay, the other piece, that, again, I'm an EMS and I love EMS. We got to change the EMS mindset. EMS was initial, when I was a new EMS guy, 100 years ago, everything came to our hospital. Transfer patients. You know, that maybe in a month, we transfer 5 patients to another center. We do that sometimes before lunch today, okay? So it's changed for EMS, and the EMS staffing pattern has not changed. The EMS mindset has not changed in the other areas. We've got to get them to change and understand. I have friends in the business who simply say, if it's a level, I'm gonna have 1 or 2 ambulances in the county no matter what. So while they're bleeding to death in the hospital, they're sitting on their hands waiting for something to come in. And it doesn't make sense. We got to change that mindset. We got to work with him. The biggest thing is we need to train together. The EMS people and the physicians and the nurses need to train together so they know one another and they quit with this. And it's on both sides of the ER. Let's face it, I see nurses doing this. I see medics doing this. I see me doing this sometimes. We got to quit doing that and start working together, because as we get mad at one another, it's the patient in the middle that suffers. And I think March calls, I'm in so tickled with Dr. Patterson, Dr. Registers, and Dr. A. We had 3 physicians down there, another online, that are very interested in helping fix this problem, because it's all of our problems. Damien Scott's my boss. I will suck up him a little bit. He's big Georgia Hospital Association, and he called them and they put it on their fall meeting. I think he's going to speak, Dr. Patterson, Dr. Register, maybe to tell the administrators, the other folks, that they need to hear how important this is. There's one other key component that would like for us to involve, and that's the County Commissioners Association in Georgia. I know some of those folks. Those folks control the mess in most areas. They're the ones who write rules for the county, and we got to make them understand how important it is to take care of patients who are critically ill, whether they're on the street or whether they're on the stretcher in the ED. And I think if we can get all those things done and get the training, then maybe it's a big difference. Anything we talked about the GHA.
Yeah, I just, well, since you gave me the floor, I'm gonna just mention something, but the level 3, level 4 centers, you were about to show this map that you showed earlier where there's this empty spot. But I got to thinking, a lot of the rural hospitals, if they're nonprofit, qualify for the Georgia Heart Program, and they rank those. And I'm so excited. I'm no longer in my career. I've been the CEO of the top 5 most needy hospitals. Okay, so but I'm no longer in the top 5. But none of these trauma centers are anywhere near the top 5. We're the lowest ranked, 18th most needy. But what we were just talking about is there's a lot of centers out there that are in this kind of top 15, 20. Even though that, and I feel like that 80,000, I'm not disparaging your work on it or not, but I think it's underreported, the effort that goes into it. But even that 80,000, there's a lot of hospitals that look at that and say there's no way we can dedicate that amount of money to it. Because they have maybe, between 0 and 4 days cash on hand is normal for the rural hospitals. So, but I think that this March pause is a good way to get them to feel a little bit more confident about this. And especially in that region right there, I would think that would be a fantastic idea. There's a little bit, right, and then over where we are, kind of in toward, there, and then also over by Augusta, you got that yellow spot. That's another great opportunity there.
Sure.
to teach this.
But in Dr. O, raise your hand back there, Dr. O's our ER representative, been working with us a lot. And hopefully what we'll be able to do is roll out a prototype course by August, hopefully have a few test courses done at that point and be able to give a report by August of how we can roll this out to the rest of the state. What we would like to do is ultimately, eventually at that point, get a train the trainers event. We're looking at maybe a one-day course and mannequins, just like ATLS or TNCC, any of those type courses, so that we can teach some of the patients who, some of the providers who don't have the resources to go take an ATLS class. You know, someone who has to provide education to my staff, $600 or $700 per staff member is a lot of money for me to spend to go send my ER docs, my surgeons to maintain their status. It's a tremendous cost. And so I know these centers couldn't afford that. And so what we're going to try to do is go to the individual hospitals and have enough trainers to go and have an EMT, a nurse, and a physician teach the course so that we can speak to all levels, but also show them it's a multidisciplinary course that we can teach and hopefully improve their education. And maybe make them want to pursue the ATLS certification if they're a physician or a provider. Maybe go on to TNCC or ENPC, any of those things that they can provide or go on to do themselves. So I think it has the potential to raise the educational awareness among providers, but also help us out for improved outcomes. Anybody else? Yeah, Gordon.
I'm gonna plug one other thing that I don't know if y'all know about, but I chair the EMS subcommittee on the trauma commission, and we do a lot of EMS training, as mentioned earlier. But one of the things that we do is a cadaver lab. So we go around the state and put these labs on. We've done one in every region, I think, every year. So they're fairly close. And we take human bodies and we bring medics and nurses and physicians in, and they get to see how to do things on real people. And when we did it in Swainsboro, I had Dr. Headley was the surgeon there. We got with Dr. A and the ER docs, and we came in, we had separate mannequins for them, and they just put in chest tubes. And I think everyone in the ER physicians came to that. And it's a resource that's available to you. Doesn't cost a thing. Your physicians can go, your nurses can go, and if you don't know about it, let me know, and I'll see if I can get you on the mailing list so that you know where those courses are. Our nurses took the same class, and they just love it.
All right. Thanks, Gordon. As I get my technical expert up here, I'm not an Apple person, sorry. The other thing I want to talk about is the ACS consultative process. As you heard this morning, I think that Dr. Ashley talked about, not only have we engaged ACS to have the first in the nation, a rural consultative Georgia statewide initiative to look at. That's been in the ongoing works. We're working on trying to come up with questions we wanted to work with them on. I think you see some of the things you saw here. What's the rural best practices that we have for the state, for the region and territories that we can replicate across the board in Georgia to improve that network you saw before, that yellow leaching paint, abstract there. We want that to be just solid. I'm a very simple person, like one color and that's it. Okay, just put it up there and be done with it. And we ultimately want to know other things such as risk and benefits of trauma center waivers for specialty services and equipment, looking at acute care facilities incentivization to participate. Also look at telemedicine models specific to trauma. We talked about that today as one of the potential helps that we can reach other facilities. We're transferring a lot of patients that don't necessarily need to be transferred. We're also, which is delaying some of the patients who do need to be transferred, and also tying up EMS trucks on the road. And so one of the other processes we talked about today was, is there a way to develop a rural, kind of the old mail delivery service, if you think about, where they, have one horseback rider and then they switch the bags and the next horseback rider would take over. That's what we wanted to do ultimately, to see if we could come up with an EMS crew that could do that. So we could transfer people, not to take units out of counties that are critical counties that have one truck or two trucks, to keep those counties uncovered, because that seems to be a big problem and a big decision point for the EMS crews out here. Also to include ensuring clinical competency and procedures. That's one of the things that March Pause hopefully will help take care of. Interfacility transport to maintain contractual arrangements is one of the things I think we need to work on. I was used to having contractual arrangements as a level 2. I have, a receiving contracts with multiple different places, pediatric transfer contracts or agreements in place that I had before. We have to redo those every couple of years. One of the things we want y'all to get into the prospect of doing. Efficient utilization of blood in rural centers to minimize waste. But the other part of that is we want to be able to hopefully change EMS to be able to give blood and transport. And that would be very helpful. That's a big part of what the AKI group was talking about today was, is there a way we can tell the rural hospitals how we want someone resuscitated? Because there is improved outcomes if you use blood products as opposed to crystal. Very good articles out there to prove that as far as AKI. And then ultimately improve our optimal level of training and licensure for the rural medics so they can give blood is another prospect. And the optimal size of regional areas for effective system integration. Some of the questions that we're asking the ACS. And we have a tentative date for when they're coming in?
They said that, so they finally agreed, you were on the email to do, no, that's for that's for the level.
That's for level 4.
Yeah, the TSF visits, but, they finally answered us via email. Renee, you were included in that, where they agreed to do this as a pilot, and they were going to put together a proposal for us. So we had originally asked for a target date in the fall, so they haven't really set a date yet, but it's encouraging that they're willing to go ahead and do this, because I think having folks from other really rural areas come in and share with us, again, in the spirit of not having people from the urban areas tell you how we should do it in the rural areas, having other folks that have expertise in this sort of thing come in and visit us and look at rural specific things. So it's very exciting. And as soon as we hear something where you're included on the emails too, so as soon as we know better about a date, because they will set up meetings, because you got to remember, we always kind of focus on the South Shore area, but we have some northern areas that are very rural too. So we need to make sure that we're inclusive.
One of the other things Dr. Ashley just mentioned also was the level 4 consult visits that we're going to have with the Pennsylvania Trauma Foundation. That date's been set for October 11th through the 15th. And you'll be hearing about those if you're involved in that. And again, it's just a peek under the hood to make sure everything's preventatively maintained. I want to make sure that, we're just getting ideas of, are you doing this, are you doing that, and showing you some love, if you will, to give you some help in implementing some of these things. And we don't know what you don't know. And a lot of times we don't know what we don't know until someone tells us. At that point, we tend to overlook it. So hopefully that will also help. And you should be hearing more about that as it gets closer to October. Sure, please.
I just say that this is, anytime somebody comes and reviews this, there's always that thing that you want to make yourself look as good as you can. This is the time to be honest. And if you don't have something to say, if you don't do it, say you don't do it, because we want to try and get you help. So if you say, oh, everything's fine, okay, let's move on to the next challenge, you see. So it's like when I had my site visit for consultative, I wanted them to find everything they could. If there was anything questionable, I wanted it written down, because I wanted to be able to correct it when I had my look at it. So be open, be honest. This is the time to maybe, let people see what you have or don't have, because then we can try to get you resources.
And your report is yours. We're not getting access to that. It's for you. But we have put it in the contract with PTSF that they will come to the November commission meeting and give an aggregate report of strengths, opportunities, and recommendations. And we want you to see that report too, because you should really be the ones that make the decisions about what recommendations come forward. But that way, to Dr. Ashley's point, let them see everything, because we need to hear about what you can and can't do. And some of those more mature systems, I think, to the readiness cost point of the 81,000, the orange book and the subsequent version of the gray book, it's lean when it comes to fours, because the ACS doesn't specialize in fours. So the systems that are more mature, they have more criteria. If you go on PTSF's website, TCAP for Texas, They have additional criteria. If we made additional criteria for you, it would cost you more. So we have to balance that once we find out.
Any questions about that? Any comments? And the consultative visits and the site visits I've had in the past have been incredibly helpful. And as a trauma medical director, and you're in that position, you should sideline some of these people while they're there and tell them what you think your weaknesses outside, you know, on the sidebar note. And everyone I've ever had interview me has asked me to come outside and say, all right, tell me is there anything really you need that I can help you with? And in the past, I've asked for things. I've asked for, you know, I think I need another CT scanner when, you know, we were a level 2 years ago. I remember asking for that. I remember asking for a PI coordinator full-time position. I told them my registrar position was half-time with almost 650 patients. I needed a full-time, you know, and these were things that I didn't know if they had seen them, but I wanted to point them out. I wanted to point out my weaknesses outside the official meeting area, and that it helped out quite a bit. Access to specialty care on your agenda. We had originally also, one of the first projects we did right out of the gate was to tell you where things are in the state. We'd like to update that and start formally updating that on maybe a quarterly basis. That came up again last night in the GQIP advisory or executive advisory committee meeting, which I'm the representative for that in the rural centers. Is we don't know who does what, and there's certain parts of the month that they may not be doing it. So not everybody does replant in the system, you know, all the time. And so I didn't think this would actually come to help me, but it did a couple of weeks ago when I had a traumatic arm amputation, and in the middle of the night, and you know, I had the numbers available for me. I called multiple people, had the patient accepted, and unfortunately we couldn't fly. And it was too far away to do anything, and ultimately had to complete the amputation at that point. But those are some of the examples of things we have on there. Who has ECMO available? Who does pediatrics? What are their age limits? Who does burns? What's their contact information? All this is on a spreadsheet. We did send out laminated copies of that to everybody. Hopefully you've gotten that, and we'll continue to update that. We hopefully will come up with some type of widget or app that the trauma medical directors can participate at some point. Again, that's probably a couple of years off, but at least maybe apply for a grant and use the GQIP research fellow to kind of come up with something. And ultimately that we can update almost weekly who's on call for this across the state if you need something. And then we also talked in the past about the web-based registry and contracted abstraction services. I didn't think I would need that either when we talked about that. And sure enough, not 2 months later after the August meeting, I wound up needing some help with my registrar. My registrar currently left. I've just hired another registrar. So do you have anything on that? I know Gina had really been the person behind that.
Yeah, on the web-based registry for the amended budget, we had put in the what the difference would be to get I think 3s and 4s on the web-based registry. That way you don't have to have like your IT folks maintaining this cumbersome database that sits on that you got to get IT people involved in all the time. The updates are pushed out to you. It's so nice, and we really just kind of need to go that way. So we put that, the amended budget should be voted on this week, hopefully, and if that passes, then that's wrapped up in there. So the
July budget,
registry,
right?
correct.
July state
So well, it would, yes, it would be.
July 2023.
That would be
22.
next fiscal year. So this is still this fiscal year. So you would get it. We would have to work out how to get it to you because we have to figure out where you all are in your registry contracts and that sort of thing. So it's essentially going to be an additional registry supplemental thing to cover you for the costs because the web-based is a little bit more expensive, as you can imagine. So it will close that gap. The contracted services, maybe we need to, if there's still interest in that. Last time everybody seemed like they were okay, but I know you're like one broken arm or leg away from not having data for 3 months. So that we want to try to mitigate that as best we can. And maybe we need a little work group of the TPMs or registry folks from this group to kind of say, what can we do? Because I can't pay for that because your hospital, which is great, we have the administrators in the room. you have to have BAA agreements with people that are handling your data and getting into your EMRs, so I can't do that. I could reimburse you for that, but we just need to come up with a structure of what that might look like. I think you would get a lot of support to do it because we don't have any window into what's going on in your center if we don't have your data, right? So I don't know what the best option for that is, but if you work it out, I'll get you money for it, right, Dr.?
It also brings up the arbormetrics question that hopefully, from seeing the original arbormetrics presentation back at the Hotel Nico in 2014, I think it was, to what it finally is today.
You have been.
I've been around a long time, unfortunately. I want to ask Dr. Ashley what the first time I actually met him was. He doesn't remember that at all. No, well, yeah, we had floods and rocks. Actually, it was when we both became ACLS fellows. I met you at a door. Anyway, arbormetrics project should be very good because it now will include level 4s and we'll get real-time data for the level 4s, which again, at this point, we will be on an even keel with the level 3s and the level 1s and level 2s. And now we've got voice, and now we need to start using that voice in these meetings to speak up, participate. With that in mind, we had tabled 2 projects that we had talked about in our last meeting. One of those was PI-specific projects for us. So I know that a lot of people aren't participating in the AKI project. Maybe we're participating with the TBI project. The opioid project, I think, is very applicable even to us as a level 3s and 4s. We probably don't see a huge number of patients that we keep that would ultimately go on to AKI. And if you had dialysis services needed, you'd probably transfer those patients out. So the 2 we'd come up with originally were hip fracture care and geriatric trauma care. And do those seem applicable so we can start to look toward trying to form some kind of work group to work around those and see what we can come up with to improve those cares? Or any other comments or any other projects from the floor at this point? Got a few more minutes to talk about that, and then we need to adjourn so I can keep you on time. Yes, sir.
I think you're actually got trauma care.
The geriatric trauma care. I think one of the things we deal with, I know we've looked at our average ages of our patients. And if you think about geriatric trauma care, it's not to me what the ACS says it is. 65 is to me not geriatric trauma care. The ACS says it is, but 55, and that's the cut point where we see increased use of DOACs and anticoagulants for AFib. And so we start to see these very sick patients that come in that will bleed to death if we don't have things we need to do to treat them. And ultimately, I think some of those things may be an important process of that as well. So I'll put out some feelers about the work group, maybe send out an email about the hip fracture care and who wants to be involved with that, and also geriatric trauma care, so we can come up with some guidelines to see what we can put together to improve care across the state. Any other comments? You might want to talk about anything? Sure, your floor.
Is there anything more specific for the level 4s? Because you might not, would hip fracture make sense to you, or, okay, good.
The other thing I think we want, yes, sir.
Yeah. So yes, I'm at a level 4 at Morgan Medical Center. And one thing that I know that most level 4 have difficulty with is trying to get in touch with a trauma specific center to see which one of those traumas they feel like it's a non-surgical and can stay in-house versus which one needs to move up the road. And most of it comes about with this problems that we're having where there's a bunch of trucks going to level 1s and level 2s, and they're probably overwhelmed with a lot of trauma cases. So I think something like a pelvic fracture that could stay in a level 4 that is just being controlled and not a surgical related thing. It helps having a system where someone can reach out to for a consult, then they get a feedback and say, hey, keep this one at your facility as a patient that we're not going to do any surgery on, rather than non-surgical patients being sent down the road and overwhelmed with level 1 to level 2.
I think our process, but we're together, so I think our process is when we have a patient that we need transferred to, you know, our go-to is usually Piedmont Athens. We're calling their transfer center, and you've got an ER doctor talking to an ER doctor versus an ER doctor having the ability to actually talk to one of those trauma surgeons that can help better make that decision, because usually the ER doctor at Piedmont Athens or wherever is like, yeah, send them on. Versus being able to make a better decision on, yeah, I think your facility can stabilize and handle that just for pain management, or, you know, and then eventually follow up with the rehab and follow up with the orthopedic surgeon. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yes, sir.
I think that's a great issue that everybody struggles with, and so if we can figure out how to fix that. So I wonder, because like sometimes I will get those calls, you know, most of them end up coming, but every now and then I get a call on the transfer center, and it sounds like it's hospital and region dependent. So I think we need to dive in, really, everybody will have to look and see what's going on in their own facility. But I will get those calls sometimes. Our transfer center, I mean, you don't send to us, but you're not our,
Right.
you know, you're more than Athens. But I'll get a call from the transfer center, says there's a Dr. So-and-so from hospital X wants to just talk about this trauma patient. And they'll actually say sometimes, see if they need to come or stay, and we'll have a conversation, and sometimes they can stay. That gives them the confidence that, and not every, you know, maybe I'm just weird, but not everybody on my side, everybody on my side is comfortable doing that, because they think, well, I'm taking my ability, I'm making a decision on a patient I've never seen. You know, I'm pretty comfortable doing that, just because I know from your story, you know, I sort of know what, you know, I cannot with perfect accuracy, but I'm going to take anything questionable. So if it's really a soft call and it can stay or even maybe come and be followed up as an outpatient or something. So I think that has a real benefit for the referring hospital if we can make that happen and standardize it. So maybe, Liz, I think, and I look at you because I'm trying to think how to operationalize this. Is there a way for us, the commission, to help pair up level 4s with their appropriate facility, which they know who that is? But to get past the big door and the big gate into the trauma surgeon, somebody to pair up name to name, like, I need to know your name, you need to know my name, and we need to be able to talk and say, and set up a process on how this works. You see what I mean? Just, we need to know each other, is what I'm trying to get at. Is there a way to line up people that we can maybe do that?
Well, I think if we go back and we re-update the, our working tablet, if you will, of where the trauma centers are, and then just go through and geographically identify all the 3s and 4s and where they would ultimately transfer patients to the nearest one, and then their backup, at least one backup, maybe even a second backup, and list those with you, and then ultimately contact those hospitals. You can individually do that and say, look, would you be willing to pair up with Morgan Medical as a primary catchment area and then a secondary catchment hospital? I imagine you would either go to Augusta or you would go to, I guess Gwinnett, maybe would be the next one. Macon?
Maybe
Macon.
yeah.
Okay, so I mean, you've got 3, but you're kind of in that triangle right there. So also try to do that and put a name on it and say, this is who you need to contact, or this is the line you need to talk to, and you need to tell them this is a non-transfer trauma consult to talk to the on-call trauma surgeon, talk to the level 1s and level 2s and tell them what we're coming up with. This feeds into that big project that I think is too big to really tackle as one project. I think we have to tackle smaller pieces of it, is the transfer issues. And I would like to put together a transfer work group that ultimately tries to identify the different processes that are there that we have problems with. Not enough EMS in our county, or EMS not willing to leave, but EMS related issues, accepting facility issues, and then telemedicine. Telemedicine would be huge. And I think GQuip is behind that as well, because this came up, this same topic came up yesterday in the executive GQuip meeting about how telemedicine would probably help us. We piloted a program in our hospital years ago looking at telemedicine for wound care, because the average ambulance transport for a patient from a nursing home is $700. And it was more to transport them than the surgeon got to do anything at the wound care center, we basically cut down costs dramatically and then started sending people out to the nursing homes in a batch fashion to see patients, and it really helped out. But I think we can come up with better ways to treat trauma patients without necessarily always transferring them.
Yeah, I agree. I think the most permanent solution that I can imagine would be something that we have a telestroke call, that we
Right.
call teletrauma.
Yeah.
Where a trauma doctor from a remote place doesn't even have to be the hospital next to us.
Right.
Will essentially comment on the case, look at stuff, and then make a note that goes in the chart to take some help and responsibility on that case. Like a pinpoint subarachnoid hemorrhage shouldn't have to transfer 3 hours. and
That was the-
surgical case.
That was the example that was given yesterday, was the pinpoint subarachnoid that just needed a follow-up scan the next morning. Wouldn't your hospital like to get the admission for that patient,
Yeah,
ultimately follow that patient up the next day, do the CT and then discharge that patient? That would be very helpful for a lot of the people in Georgia to maintain the funds in those hospitals. Yes, sir.
I would say there's an educational component with the hospitals too,
Sure.
that I'm in with level 4 of All Stars. It's nice that we have a larger group that we can transfer to, but we found it was hard at the new level 4 to keep those patients in house. We just gotta find that.
Sure.
We don't have in-house neurology, we don't have in the center. We did have we started a neurosurgery program, so they can just write a note in there. It
Sure.
really made a big difference.
We probably need to look at those individual things, the teleneurology, the telestroke, or any of those things. There was a model already out there, and a lot of the level 4 centers and level 3 centers have the telemedicine equipment available. So we don't need that, and if we don't have it available, if you don't have it available, maybe we can work on grants for you to get the equipment. That's one of the things we can come out with this group. So, I'm sorry, what was your name?
S.A. Kurogi.
All right. Liz, can you write that down? You open your mouth, this is place is really cool. I've learned that lesson already.
He's at my town.
Oh, okay, perfect, okay. Anything else, anybody else? We're running a couple minutes behind.
I would
now.
just like to add to, I think the hospitalist education is a big component that we at the individual hospitals need some support from the Georgia Trauma Commission
Okay,
and some of the larger level 1 and level 2 facilities. Carrie and I were just sitting here having the conversation. There are many of the patients that, when I review charts of patients that went out, that I think we could check that.
sure,
And it's a willingness of the hospitalist to admit that patient.
sure,
And I think the single individual note makes the ER physician and the surgeon feel comfortable,
sure.
but it does not secure the hospitalist that's going to be responsible primarily for that admission. And so I think figuring out some way that we could do statewide education to include them
Okay.
would be a big help.
Yes,
John from Cartersville. So speaking of the hospital's education and their recent ACS survey, that was huge. They really dug into it when it comes to it, when it comes to anything leaving that might can stay. The hospital is the weak point for everybody. And so that was a talk about how far do you involve your hospitals in your goods programs, how far do you involve in everything. And so it's not just the education, but also involvement in the trauma service itself. Because often that's not seen as a direct portion. That was actually a key recommendation people. And so that's definitely.
Here's Jeff, can you write that down?
Right, right now.
I'm learning something from Ryan, that's great. All right, well, good. So I think right now we'll start to work on hip fracture care, geriatric trauma issues, and then transfer related issues, and may ultimately divide that up into multiple different groups if we can. And hopefully we'll have we'd like to set up a date for another meeting, maybe a conference call, to give some people some updates. In 3 months, maybe May, is that okay, before we have our August meeting? We'll send out, I guess, maybe a survey.
We'll send out an invite, yeah, and it would be, maybe we might even want to consider April, because the commission meets again in May. So it'd be nice to just have some of these things like a little bit more formalized. Yeah.
All right. And then again, we'll probably have at least a conference, maybe a Zoom call or a conference call before August, to make sure we set an agenda. Anybody wants to participate in that? I really appreciate everybody. I think this is amazing. you're finally getting your seat at the table, and we need to keep occupying that as many seats as we can, so we can keep our voices loud, so.
Can I ask one question
Sure,
about
please.
August, since I haven't, because I almost forgot about this? For August, the grade book criteria is changing, or the orange book is changing to gray, so new standards. And we can potentially have a level 3, level 4 optimal course, the course that teaches you about the criteria. They have the slide deck ready to go to just plug in the new updates. So I have 2 people on deck that are like, as soon as they release the criteria, we can get the slide deck done in 2 weeks. So if they release it by August 1st, you can have the course at your meeting. So would you guys be interested in an optimal course? Okay. And the nice thing about it for fours too, that'll be before PTSF comes to do your consult visit. So
Right.
you'll get a lot of good support about how to prepare for the visit.
That'd be
Okay, so
awesome.
I will set that up. Okay.
Great.
It might be an extra day travel to St. Simon's, but the bulk of you are kind of towards that way anyway. So, and yeah, I know, shucks. You gotta be okay.
I can see a level 3, 4 meet and greet at the bar. I'll work on the planning for that one as well. That's not before the right week. Anyway, I appreciate it. We'll see you adjourned. Thank y'all.